Let me start off by saying that I hope this will be a conversation, and I hope you'll take me at my word that I would be happy to be interrupted at any time. So feel free to jump in if you want to take us off on a little bit of a tangent or ask a question or want some clarity. By all means, do so. This morning I had a meeting at the Atlantic Council about Bosnia, actually, and I spent 2.5 years there as an international law advisor to the government of Republika Srpska. If you know Bosnia, you'll know that was kind of a challenging role. It was interesting because I was talking about the problem of addressing Bosnia today is that everybody talks about narratives and they stick to them regardless of whether reality has anything to do with things at the time. So, you know, fierce commitment to narratives is a real problem. So on my way over here, I was thinking about some of the challenges that we have in talking about maritime safety and security in Africa. And unfortunately, narratives also play an unhelpful role here, as I think there are a lot of misconceptions about Africa, about African states, and about the threats that Africa faces. It's very easy to repeat a list of things from piracy to illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing to trafficking of all sorts, weapons, narcotics, humans, and sort of just keep things at almost a conceptual level. But what I'd like to do is to try to talk about three main regions: the North, the West, and the East. Talk about two threat trends in those regions, and then talk about one principal response that is cooperation and how it's played out in each of those regions, and not just talk about it from an academic or theoretical standpoint, but really delve into some of the examples of what's going on. So with that, I understand that you guys have already had a session today about the North and the Mediterranean and some of the challenges there. So I will downplay that a little bit. But a couple of interesting points about what's happening in North Africa. The migration issue is obviously the principal narrative right now, and it is actually horrific to hear what a business the migration situation has created in North Africa. Anybody have any idea how much a transit costs per person? You're looking at about 2,000 euros per person, and a small rigid inflatable will create a profit for the owner of about $68,000 per voyage, and that's freight on board. That means as soon as they're on the ship leaving the shore, they have $68,000 of profit in their pocket. Doesn't matter if the boat gets there or not. They've got that $68,000. How about one of the bigger boats, the big wooden ones? Any guess? $350,000. And we're talking hundreds of these ships are leaving the shores. Not only, unfortunately, a percentage of them making it to the other side. So you're looking at a big business that's coming into play, and with business tends to come other criminal activity. And so one of the problems that we'll see throughout the different regions is that when you focus on one issue, and I was just having this conversation, when you focus on one issue, migration, everybody tends to ignore some of the other issues, and the narrative ends up being all about the migration, and we sometimes get blindsided by other things that are starting to occur under the radar. So in the Med right now, there are other criminal activities that are popping up. They're not getting talked about, but raiding of underwater cultural heritage sites has become a big issue. With the destruction of cultural property in Iraq and Syria, and the illicit networks that have begun to sell off what's been taken out of there, there's been a growing market and a growing network moving all sorts of stuff. That includes underwater graves, underwater archaeological sites. While that may not seem like a big deal, the more money that goes into criminal networks, the more opportunity there is for other stuff to move through them. So you're seeing almost a fortification of trafficking networks occurring through the Med while everybody's focused on migration. Additionally, one of the main themes that we're going to talk about in all three sections is the creativity of criminals. And creativity comes in two forms these days: business, which is what we've just been talking about, and their legal consciousness. So they're getting more business savvy and they're becoming more legally conscious. Now, in terms of the legal consciousness in the Med, there is a situation that has only just started to really be talked about in the news, but has been a worry for some time. Maritime law is full of weird, archaic loopholes. And what happens at sea is fundamentally different than what happens on land in terms of how things are treated. So before I say anything more, how many of you guys are actually maritime focused? Is there anyone that? Okay, we got one. Okay. Two. Okay, good. So there are these international conventions that relate to maritime activity that govern all conduct on the water, particularly with regard to commercial ships. But the Safety of Life at Sea Convention requires that anybody who is in distress, or when a ship comes across somebody who is in distress, that they help them. They have to save their lives. And this comes up regardless of what activity they were involved in. So for years, the U.S. Coast Guard has had to save people engaged in drug trafficking and all sorts of criminal activity because that is legally what they have to do. So first save them, then sort out the issues. But when you suddenly end up with a very crowded maritime space of people desperately trying to get across from one shore to another, there is a chance that they can start using mechanisms that are perhaps a bit more nefarious. So in the piracy situation off East Africa, which we'll talk about in a sec, self-inflicted distress was used as a way of wooing ships out of their course, slowing them down, and making them vulnerable to attack. So a pirate vessel would call for help, get a commercial ship to slow down, and when the ship slowed down, they would go and attack it. What's possible and unfortunately likely in the Med that's a bit different is actually inflicting distress inside of a vessel. So sinking yourself so that the vessel has to rescue the individuals. Now, a lot of rescue is happening at sea every day because of the natural sinking of these vessels. But if somebody did it intentionally with the very specific intent of getting onto a very specific vessel, there is a chance they could do so in order to perpetrate harm. In other words, you've got 100 migrants on a boat, the 99th of whom actually has a vest strapped to his chest. They intentionally sink the vessel in order to get on a ship. That ship, not having the time to vet the individuals that are coming on board, brings everybody on board to try and save them. And once on board, the individual detonates himself. So those kinds of things, and that's sort of the extreme, but those kinds of things are possible and are starting to come up as serious concerns for not just the international response, so not just EU NAV4 Med and NATO, but commercial vessels that are transiting the Med that really have not had to be involved in the migrant situation as much thus far. So we're seeing this creativity being a really difficult thing to counter. So how do you actually respond to this? Well, the response in the Med, as you probably heard this morning, is cooperation broadly. EU NAV4 Med has an operation called Sophia, named after a very specific baby girl. I'm impressed by their commitment to keeping a human element to the whole piece, but it is a very difficult picture for a lot of the European states. I'll pause there because I know you guys have heard a lot about the Med. I just thought those were some of the more interesting points that I could bring out. Does anybody want to ask about the North before we move into the probably thornier pictures of the East and the West? All right. East Africa probably has the strongest narrative. You've got the Captain Phillips story, you've got sort of Somali piracy, and I think most people probably think that Somali piracy is still a really big problem. There hasn't been a successful reported attack, anyway, on a commercial vessel in 3 years. Somali piracy is, in many ways, old news. And the response, which sort of involved both international forces and the use of private armed guards, was largely successful in stopping pirate attacks. However, this goes to the point of creativity of criminals. There is still a huge amount of the people that committed piracy are still there. The networks are still there. And there is still a huge amount of capacity to essentially re-enliven that exact same problem. However, they're a bit smarter about it. They got lots of ransom money for quite a few years. And so those criminal networks, which never really got taken down, they never got pierced, are still there and are looking for new ways of operating. One of the overarching themes or lessons that came out of Somali piracy is that piracy is a land-based problem with maritime symptoms. And this goes to a real fundamental point about maritime security and safety in Africa, which is that every maritime problem has a land connection. And I like to illustrate this with some statistics. The NATO Alliance Maritime Strategy quotes a sort of series of numbers about the importance of the maritime domain to the world. And they say that 70% of the Earth is covered in water. 80% of the world's population lives within 100 miles of the coast, and 90% of world trade happens by sea. And this is all to say the maritime space is really important to us. But I always say they really need to add one more statistic, which is that 100% of the world's population lives on land. And as funny as that is, and as flippant as that is, we often forget that. And so there's in terms of conceptualizing maritime safety and security, we often think of it as distant and separate from what happens on land. But maritime space is an extension of what's happening on land. And if you're talking about maritime security problems or safety problems, you're talking about people who live on land. And so all those problems start and end on land. And so this goes to one of the overarching lessons from Somalia, which is the governance piece. And if you don't crack the governance piece and you don't crack what's going on land, you are just waiting for the next maritime problem to come up. It's already coming up. In Somalia, we are not pirate-free. We are pirate-free perhaps on reported attacks on commercial vessels engaged in legitimate international commerce. But in the last 6 to 8 months, there have been a number of attacks, Somali pirate attacks, on vessels that have been engaged in illicit trafficking. So what we are seeing is a new wave of criminal on criminal crime. Very creative, because they are intentionally targeting vessels that are engaged in activities that nobody else wants to deal with. So it presents a really interesting problem for the international community. Where do you interdict? What's the main focus? Do you want to get the traffickers or do you want to get the stick-up guys? I'm from Baltimore, and there's always sort of that secondary criminal. If you've seen The Wire, you've seen Omar. These are the Omars. These are the guys that are robbing the traffickers. So it's a really interesting dynamic developing. And it really speaks to the ongoing sophistication. And it also goes back to the point of the legal sophistication, because what is happening is that a lot of the vessels that are engaged in this weird criminal interplay are making use of tactics to avoid detection. They are changing their flag at sea. So they are making it difficult to identify where they're coming from, where they're registered. They're changing the name at sea of the ship. Now, these are purely, unequivocally illegal activities under international law, but sometimes very hard to detect. And the other thing they're doing is they're making use of fishing vessels, which are expected to be on the water, so nobody's necessarily paying all that much attention to them. And so we're seeing a complex and increasingly sophisticated piece in the Mediterranean. So going to the narrative piece, if you just talk about Somali piracy as it was 2005 to 2013, you really miss out on what's going on today, which is much, much more interesting and much more difficult. So what else can we say that is interesting about the threat picture? Well, there are three types of trafficking. There's trafficking of illegal substances or illegal goods. So you got movement of narcotics, for example. There's illegal trafficking of goods or people. So human smuggling is one. The people are not inherently illegal, but the movement of them may be. But then there's a third type of trafficking that is coming up in East Africa that is also very interesting, and this also speaks to the business sophistication of the criminal networks that got essentially emboldened by ransom money, which is that they are engaged in the legitimate commerce of legitimate goods for illegitimate purposes. In other words, they have an entire business that is entirely focused on funding illicit activity. And does anybody know what commodity they are principally trading in East Africa for illicit purposes? Charcoal. Charcoal, exactly. Charcoal, high value for shisha pipes in the Middle East. Moving from East Africa to the Middle East is a massive source of funding for illicit networks in principally Al-Shabaab in East Africa. So again, using legitimate channels for illegitimate purposes makes for a very difficult maritime interdiction picture, which goes back to the point: you got to solve the problem on land. Another trend, in addition to the creativity of criminals, is the increasingly muddy waters of non-state actors involved in maritime safety and security. In the Mediterranean, the issue is the increase in the migration and a lot of the humanitarian organizations and NGOs that are working on that piece. But in East Africa, the story is private maritime security companies. This is a topic that gets a lot of people really excited. The likes of Blackwater on land suddenly moved to the water and created a challenging regulatory piece for the international community for a number of years. I was heavily involved with a lot of the efforts to develop regulation for the armed guards on land. That was my background. That's my principal expertise. And when the Maritime case hit, a fundamental mistake was made, suggesting that these same guys that were doing security on ships were actually more a subset of the maritime industry, i.e. commercial shipping, than they were of the security industry. So a couple of very strong characters convinced everybody of that and managed to get all the regulations focused to be about what was happening on commercial vessels transiting the high-risk area off Somalia. And for years, commercial shippers have been hiring armed guards. It's been a very successful deterrent in preventing attacks. No ship was ever successfully attacked with armed guards on board. But because of the decline in piracy, ship owners don't want to pay as much money for armed guards, or any at all. So all these companies sprung up. 173 new companies showed up in the UK alone in 2011. Massive boom in this private maritime security industry. And now you're looking at a situation where, whereas it would be $8,000 a day for an individual on a ship at the very peak, who was an ex-Royal Marine or ex-Special Boat Service from the UK, you're now looking at a picture where you're paying $2,000 for one or two sort of Malaysians or Indonesians to be on your ship with a gun. The price in the market, the willingness to take on high-end guards has declined massively. And so there's a lot of people out of work, a lot of businesses looking for new opportunities. And not surprisingly, they're getting involved in activities that are different than armed guards on ships transiting the high-risk area off Somalia. With them was also a whole network. Floating armories became a major facilitator for use of armed guards. Literally offshore armories where you could check in, check out, and embark and disembark both weapons and individuals, made an absolute fortune to support the counter-piracy efforts. They still exist. Those efforts are no longer underway. They're looking for new markets. So there's a complexifying criminal picture in South Asia and East Africa regarding that element, where you have now a commercial sort of industry that is now looking for new business. And unfortunately, it is finding opportunities in support of perhaps less than legal activities. So protecting smuggling rings, protecting others is becoming a real issue. Some of the floating armories have been tied to all kinds of criminal activity in the Maldives, in Sri Lanka, and elsewhere. So one of the threats on the horizon is what's going to happen with this glut of with companies and weapons that are looking for things to do. So I'll pause there. Those are some of the interesting points about what's happened in East Africa. Unfortunately, the picture is a little bit bleak. The forces, the combined forces, the EU NAVFOR's Atalanta, the NATO's Ocean Shield, and CMF's CTF 151 are all drawing down, or due to draw down at the end of 2016. One of them's been extended. I think EU NAVFOR has been extended. But the international cooperation that occurred in the Gulf of Aden was immense, actually. It was probably one of the most interesting examples of international maritime cooperation because you had countries that don't normally work together, US, Russia, China, India, even Iran, all working together, sometimes not directly communicating bilaterally, but working through some of these multi-state mechanisms where it was a bit more palatable. And actually everybody was pretty much on the same team for once, trying to go against piracy. And so lots of opportunities were created from that, but that's about to all start drawing down. And yet I think everybody is now aware that the problem wasn't solved, the symptoms were just treated. So we're looking at a fairly worrying picture in East Africa where it remains to be seen how much the piracy problem is really gone, so much is temporarily abated until the next wave comes. Well, I think for all the talk of the creativity and legal consciousness of criminals, a lot of them are actually really stupid. A lot of them are not actually that bright, and all you have to do is look at some of the examples. I mean, several U.S. warships were attacked by pirates who, when the lights turned on, suddenly went oops, and ended up in Norfolk, very unhappy. But oddly, they went before a judge, and I know the judge and I knew the lawyers. They were asked if their human rights were being looked after, and they actually complained the food was terrible. So I just couldn't believe that they came all the way to Norfolk and their complaint was food. But I think we're going to see new mechanisms. I think they're going to get more crafty. I think there will always be that threat until you get proper governance on land. Piracy, one of the big lessons from Somalia is that piracy doesn't happen where you have well-governed territory, and it doesn't happen where you have completely ungoverned territory. It's actually oddly where you're somewhere in the middle. And so that sort of really sort of weak, poor governance with out a huge amount of, well, with no real rule of law, but no structures, I mean, one of the things that made it so difficult to actually go against the networks on land is that they didn't have any banking institutions. It's not like where they were depositing $9 million into an account. They were handing it person to person in cash. And that makes it very difficult. Oddly, one of the things that is good about the increased network in terms of online issues in Africa, the increased internet presence in Africa, is that some of these guys are now making it much easier to track because they're texting each other about it. They're boasting, whereas it was so low tech, so hand to hand. It just disappeared, and I think we're going to see probably new waves until there's a governance piece that's really cracked on land, and I think Somalia is a unique situation on piracy. I don't think we'll ever see anything quite like it anywhere else. Because it is a failed state, but it has nevertheless a recognized government that was at the time in exile in Nairobi. They actually invited the United Nations to put in a UN Security Council allowing international forces into their territorial waters. The way it works in terms of maritime space is that countries have their land out to the shore, but then they also have the opportunity to declare maritime territory out to 12 miles. So it's full sovereign rights over those 12 miles, and then they have an exclusive economic zone that goes out to 200 miles. Now, the problem with international intervention is that warships can't just go into those 12 miles and start, busting up criminal networks. You can't do that. But in the Somali case, you had a situation where the transitional federal government actually asked the United Nations to allow warships all the way up to their coastline. So they invited this weird situation where the international community had full access to the entire maritime space. In other words, not legally, but from a practical standpoint, the high seas started at the coastline. And so everything out beyond that was fair game for international intervention. So I don't think we'll ever see that again. And certainly in transitioning now to talk about West Africa, that was one of the biggest challenges. A lot of people, I always quote Mark Twain, when your only tool is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And so I think we figured out a tool that seemed to work in East Africa, and everybody goes, oh, now there's piracy in West Africa, let's use the same tool. Couple problems with that. One, piracy in West Africa has been around a lot longer. The first International Maritime Organization resolution on piracy was in 1983, precipitated by armed robbery at sea and piracy in West Africa. Second, there is no failed state in West Africa that you can point to that would necessarily invite the UN to do something like they did in East Africa. So what you're looking at is an entire band of 12 miles of territorial sea that is under sovereign control of the states in West Africa. And unfortunately, that is where most of the attacks in West Africa have occurred up until 2016. Most of the activity in West Africa sprung out of the Niger Delta. A lot of it is tied to oil theft. So going to the business savvy, a lot of the piracy, and technically within 12 miles, it's armed robbery at sea. It's exactly the same thing, but it's not. Piracy only happens on the high seas. So the armed robbery at sea in West Africa actually studied the business model of piracy in East Africa and said that doesn't look much fun. Way out, which is dangerous, stuck on a ship for 9 months or a year waiting for a ransom, hot boat in the middle of the ocean does not sound pleasant. Let's do something different. So they said, right, no more than 5 days, quick turnaround, low ransom demand, $100,000, $200,000. For an oil tanker, that's local tax, below what anybody would even be bothered by. And maybe nick some of the oil, steal a couple 100 barrels, and if they got the right kind of oil, and they have intelligence networks, so they knew which ones were which, it was clean enough crude, Bonnie Light crude, they could go and refine it in their backyard, literally, and then sell it on through other illicit networks. So this was quite a good business model, and it's been going on for years. 2004, it was hot and busy. We just weren't paying any attention to it as the international community because it wasn't against commercial ships. People's lives weren't really in that much danger, and people weren't reporting it. 2012, people started getting really greedy, and there were copycats, and things started happening. The frequency of it, the demands were getting higher, people were getting shot. So suddenly the attention shifted around the time that Somali piracy started to really decline to West Africa. And West Africa presents a much more interesting picture, but also much more challenging picture. But with that also comes some opportunity. So what is fascinating about the networks in Nigeria in particular was that they were cellular. They were not a big organized criminal network, but they were small cells of different bits of activity that actually cooperated in a remarkably impressive way. If we could mirror that cooperation in terms of governance, we'd be in good shape. They did a very good job of figuring out who had what skills, who had what assets, and working together, and what information, and working together to make everybody happy and everybody rich. Of course, a lot of it was tied to the government. A lot of corruption involved in the picture. And if you look at what's happening right now in Nigeria with the Niger Delta Avengers, I don't know if any of you are familiar with that. We can talk about that in a minute. What you see is a situation where all of a sudden you realize that a private maritime security company hired by the government of Nigeria to stop these pirates got $173 million in contracts in the last couple of years. I don't know of any U.S. or U.K. Private maritime security company that was that successful. So incredible amounts of money moving on the legitimate side, and that was actually fueling a lot of the illegitimate as well. So huge interplay between government and non-government forces. So the to give a couple examples of how complex the picture is, we talked about armed guards in East Africa as being one of the things that worked. In West Africa, they didn't work, and they don't work. Why? Because almost all the attacks occur in the territorial sea, so you can't put armed guards on ships in that space. The states don't allow it. So what was happening was ship owners were hiring private maritime security companies to provide unarmed services and advisory services within the 12 miles. They were also then hiring the local forces, whether it was the Nigerian Navy, the Benin Navy, the Togolese Navy, whomever, to essentially provide a vessel protection detail to patrol, to secure with arms the vessel while in the territorial waters. Problem was, it got very complex, and a lot of different governmental entities started bickering, and so it became very hard to know who you were actually hiring. To give one great example, a British private maritime security company hired what they thought was the Nigerian Navy. It turned out they hired Nigerian Navy personnel off duty who were enterprising and trying to create an extra buck for themselves. So they paid the rates that you would pay to the Nigerian Navy, but paid them actually directly to a group of individuals. So they wore their uniforms, they carried their guns, and they went on the ship to provide the security. But what ended up happening was they accidentally sailed into Benin's waters. The Benin Navy boarded the ship and said, "What the heck? There's no status of forces agreement. All of a sudden, we've got foreign armed military personnel in our territory. This is a problem." It created a real international incident, and only then did everybody discover these guys were not operating in a chain of command. So that kinds of murkiness has created all sorts of problems in West Africa. Additionally, you had governmental splits in the last Nigerian regime where they suddenly created new maritime forces. So almost every country now has followed suit, and you've got a multitude of maritime security actors that are supposed to all have the same responsibility, which creates a very murky picture. You've got maritime police, you've got Coast Guard, and you've got Navy in countries that don't really have the resources to have any one of those fully functional. Makes for a complex picture. Additionally, as much as piracy and armed robbery at sea affects us and is interesting to us, it's a really kind of sexy crime. For the local states, the biggest issue there is actually, in most cases, illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing and or trafficking. So you've got IUU fishing costing, estimates vary, but it is likely in the multiple billions of dollars of lost resources each year to the coastal states of West Africa. That is a huge hit. They need that money, first of all, and second, because it's being done in an unregulated fashion, fish stocks are depleting. And they are depleting at an unbelievable rate, to the point that if they continue apace, in 40 years, they will be 90% depleted. Basically no fish in West Africa, which is currently one of the world's most abundant. And this goes again to governance on land, right? So for years, the conversation has been about sea blindness. Countries that needed to build houses, build roads, build schools, feed their people, it seems like a distraction to focus on the water. And so for years, it was difficult to get anybody to even pay any attention to maritime problems in Africa. Oddly, because of the piracy situation, international attention to it has managed to shift people's attention on land in West Africa towards the water. And so there is a renewed commitment to it. But they remain what I would call wealth blind. They aren't actually completely convinced of how much money they have in their maritime domains, whether it's offshore oil and gas or fish or even opportunities for trade and tourism. They are completely uncertain of how that could work. So you'll see weird situations where, okay, they finally get out there, finally interdict a vessel for illegal fishing, and they find that they've caught a ton of some sort of tuna. Now, if in the United States that were done in our waters, let's say the penalty was civil penalty was $1 million. In West Africa, it might be $50, but it's the exact same fish. And so there is absolutely no reason, and they say, but we're poor states. We can't do the same as the United States. And they can't quite get their heads around the fact that the value of the fish is identical, whether it's in Africa or in the United States, and the penalty should be identical, because all they're doing is right now attracting everybody who's interested in illegal fishing to their waters. So IUU fishing is a massive issue, but it also comes with other things. I said before that the East African picture was starting to use fishing vessels as a means of trafficking. It's very much true in West Africa as well. Great story recently in Liberia. Liberia was, in 1973, the #1 exporter of fish in all of Africa. In 2013, 40 years later, it exported 0. But they've actually made some efforts to try to crack down on illegal fishing. And they recently had a case where they stopped a vessel and arrested both the vessel and its cargo and its crew, let the crew go on a fine, but said, if you want the vessel, you have to buy it back. It's one of those weird anomalies of maritime law. You have to buy back your own vessel if it's been arrested. So the owners said, we can't afford it, can't do it. I said, okay. So they said, we're going to auction off the cargo and then the vessel. So they auction off the fish quickly because they didn't have much time. It's going to go bad. And the auctioneer came back to the law enforcement authority and said, well, we had a very strange auction. I said, well, what do you mean, how so? Well, we were expecting to get $40,000 for the fish. It was, not a huge amount, but a good amount of fish. But we got $90,000 for it. I said, well, that is weird. That's excellent, though. That's great. That's revenue for us. It's $90,000. That's excellent. I said, yeah, but here's the weird thing. The guys that we arrested for having stolen the fish in the first place were the ones that bought it. And suddenly they went, those weren't just fish. So those fish were actually a cover for narcotics. And so the nexus between illegal fishing and smuggling of all sorts is becoming more and more difficult to address. So narcotics have become a major issue. The movement of narcotics from South America and the Caribbean across to West Africa has been happening for years. But for years, West Africa was a transshipment hub moving up to Europe. Unfortunately, because of growing wealth on land, it has also become a destination point for a lot of the narcotics, and that's becoming a separate debilitating factor for both governance and law enforcement on land in West Africa. You're seeing a lot of narcotics whose final destination is West Africa rather than just stopping there on their way to other markets. So you're seeing, obviously, the picture. It's complicated, it's difficult, but there are a couple of other quick points that I want to make about how tricky the West African picture has become. I'll start with the IUU fishing, then I'll talk about actually some of the more recent piracy. There's a case called the Thunder. Now, the Thunder was an illegal fishing vessel, well known in the illegal fishing world, as being one of the principal vessels involved in IUU fishing all around the world. And there's an NGO called Sea Shepherd. Some of you may have heard of it. It's a fascinating group. It's a very well-funded NGO that is essentially a vigilante group. They're sort of Greenpeace for fish, but with a bit more, I would say, substance to them. And they've been tracking and following a lot of these vessels for years, and they keep a list of their 6 most wanted vessels, and this was one of them. And they actually found the vessel. They found it involved in illegal fishing in the South Atlantic, fishing for Patagonian toothfish, also known as Arctic char, sea bass. Very high-value species of fish that they were just taking in massive quantities illegally. So they started bugging the ship. They cut its nets. They actually bumped into it, and it started to flee. And what ensued was a several thousand-mile chase all the way up the coast of Africa. And so they got another ship to join the chase. So 2 Sea Shepherd vessels chased this vessel, the Thunder, all the way up into the waters of a West African country most people have probably not heard of, Sao Tome and Principe. Very small set of islands in the Gulf of Guinea, right off of both Nigeria and Gabon, sort of in that corner, sort of Gabon, Cameroon, Equatorial Guinea. So they get into the waters of Sao Tome, and almost in sight of land, they sink themselves. And this goes to what I said before about self-inflicted distress. So they just opened up all the hatches and sank the ship. It went down in minutes. And they got themselves on lifeboats and waited for Sea Shepherd, the guys that had just chased them over 1,000 miles, to rescue them. And they rescued them and took them ashore in Sao Tome and Principe. It turned out they were forum shopping. They knew exactly where, they knew they'd been caught, and they decided where they wanted to go for the best opportunity to avoid criminal prosecution. So they picked the weakest legal system and the weakest maritime state in the region on purpose. And so they ended up in Sao Tome and Principe in order to try to avoid getting caught or getting any real penalties. Absolutely fascinating case, again, looking at some of the legal complexity and the sophistication. So we're seeing much more of that, and that also translates into another case that occurred recently. West Africa has done a remarkable job of trying to develop maritime security cooperation architecture. Cooperation has been the theme throughout Northwest and East Africa in terms of how to respond. But whereas in East Africa the focus was the international community, in West Africa it had to be the local states. So there's now an incredibly impressive cascading sort of set of strategies and institutions that aim to address maritime security cooperatively. You have at the top, you have the African Union's Africa Integrated Maritime Strategy 2050 that sort of sets the tone for everybody trying to work together. But then in West and Central Africa, you have two regional communities. The Economic Community of Western African States and the Economic Community of Central African States, ECAS and ECOWAS, together with a separate body called the Gulf of Guinea Commission, that came together and created a whole sort of umbrella. They created a 25-state code of conduct for maritime security cooperation called the Yaoundé Code of Conduct in 2013 that really kind of shows political will for everybody to work together. So recognizing they don't individually have the resources to really protect their own maritime domains, maybe if they work together, they can deal with it. And that has been filtering down into to zones. Now, maritime zones have actually been surprisingly effective in starting to see this implemented. And you're seeing information sharing centers, you're seeing actual operational cooperation on the water. All of this was put to the test a couple months ago in early February when a tanker was hijacked 70 miles off the coast of Cote d'Ivoire. The ship was called the Maximus, and it was attacked by two vessels. Total of 14 pirates. Seven of them ended up going on board the Maximus, and they took it and they headed actually eastward across the Gulf of Guinea. Now, by pure accident, the United States Navy was involved in an operational training exercise with the Ghanaian Navy at the time. So our ship, the Spearhead, helped sort of initiate some of the cooperation that did occur. But ultimately, the navies of Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Togo, Benin, Nigeria, and Sao Tome and Principe all had a piece in working together to track and eventually interdict this ship. The story ended when the Nigerian Navy had two vessels catch it in the waters of Sao Tome and Principe, again a theme, and they got to the vessel and they said, stand down, you've been caught, hand over the ship, hand over the hostages. Their response was extremely telling. They actually said, no, we are in international waters. International law is on our side. And what ensued was basically a debate for 6 hours about that, whether that was true or not. It wasn't. It's completely false. I mean, it is a baseless legal argument. However, we're seeing a lot more of that, what I call legal bullying. You're seeing these criminals become more aware of laws. They latch onto them and think that they protect them to do criminal activity. Ultimately, the Nigerian Navy did storm the ship and opposed boarding. They killed one of the pirates, took the other 6 prisoner, and freed the hostages. So it is very much a success story, but it also highlighted and I won't go into all of it, but some of the weaknesses in the cooperation. Not all the navies could actually deploy far enough out to do anything. Not all of them had the resources to even cooperate in information sharing all that effectively. So while it is a success story, it also highlighted a lot of the work that needs to happen. But it is something to say, we've got some momentum, let's move forward with it. The last thing I'll say about West Africa, though, is that in 2016, we're seeing a worrying trend. Piracy has actually become the focus. It is no longer armed robbery at sea. I just told you that was a pirate case. It happened 70 miles out, well beyond 12 miles. In the first quarter of 2016, there were more kidnap for ransom cases out beyond 12 miles than in all of 2015. That seems to be a new modality of attack. And so we are seeing almost the East African model starting to show up in West Africa, only much more aggressively and with more sophisticated networks. We've also seen another case that is a bit worrying. In January, the end of January, a ship was attacked for the first time, to my knowledge, in the region, not for economic reasons, but for political reasons. It was the demand was not for money, it was for the release of Biafran prisoners. In Nigeria, we're seeing a return to the Biafran conflict of the 1960s, where East versus West versus North nearly tore apart the country. Well, it did tear apart the country, and killed several million people. And so we're now looking at a new terrorist group in the Delta called the Niger Delta Avengers. The focus in Nigeria has been on Boko Haram in the north, but in the last 3 months, this Niger Delta Avengers group has really taken hold. They have managed to intervene in the production of oil in Nigeria to the tune of dropping estimated production, budgeted production, from 2.2 million barrels a day to 1.4 million. Massive deficit now. So 40% of expected capacity, and after some of the attacks, that number dropped as low as 990,000 in a day. It is crippling the Nigerian government. And as I mentioned, there was a private maritime security company that had a $173 million contract. That has now been canceled, and that has led to a whole new criminal picture. So that's why we're seeing these attacks on the oil infrastructure. We're seeing attacks farther out, and rather than oil theft, we're seeing much more both political and personal attacks. So a very intense and complexifying picture in West Africa. But the good news is, and the one sort of solace, is that you have actually some governance issues on land that are being addressed. And you have this cooperative network that is being fortified. And because you have some success stories, you have things that you can build on. So unlike the other portions of Africa, I think West Africa, in some ways, they're seeing more criminal activity because they're addressing criminal activity. They've effectively intervened in some of the problems, and so the criminals have raised the stakes, and so now the response will have to be raised as well. But that brings me to the end of what I was going to say. So I hope we can have some discussion. It's a little bit longer than I anticipated, but I thought I'd close by saying that some of the main points: we have to be more cooperative, we have to be more creative on land, and we have to deal with governance issues. And we have to, I think, reconceive of maritime security in a lot of Africa as a development focus. One of the biggest issues is that if you just try to stomp out bad things, you just create the space for more bad things to happen. Every time there's been a cessation of some sort of criminal activity, something else has popped up. Why? Because an attractive, legitimate alternative hasn't been provided. So in order to actually end any of the criminal activity, there has to be some sort of development activity in tandem, so that you're actually building up legitimate maritime activity at the same time as stomping out bad stuff. And there are lots of ways to do that, and some of the mechanisms have been successful. We can talk about this in the discussion. But I thought I'd close with something I like to call the 7 C's. It's a maritime talk, so the 7 C's of maritime security and safety in West Africa, or in Africa at large. Number 1 is cooperation and collaboration. That is obviously a major theme. Number 2 is the need for consistent effort. One of the biggest problems is that we get excited about an issue and then we drop it. And so that's part of the problem we might be seeing in East Africa as international efforts draw down there. Clarity. One of the biggest issues with stopping criminal activity is that it might not actually be criminal. If you don't have good laws in place and you don't have clear systems for implementing those laws, you can interdict somebody, catch them, even arrest them, but then find out you can't actually prosecute them because the laws don't allow it. So you need clarity and rigor on all sorts of different fronts. We need to be looking at the current issue. Again, narratives about what happened 5 years ago are rather unhelpful, except as background for what's going on today. If we don't look at what's really happening now, we're missing the picture. And if we're not looking at what's on the horizon, we're setting ourselves up for further problems. Capacity is a big topic of conversation. And so, yes, it is really important that everybody have the ships, the equipment, and the human resource capacity to do maritime security. But if that isn't also paired with number 6, capability, you go nowhere. Angola, for example, responding to its first pirate attack and at the heyday of oil, was very close to buying an aircraft carrier off of Spain. Would have given it a lot of capacity, but as was pointed out, it wouldn't have actually given them much capability at all, because they had neither the people nor the support equipment to actually make use of it. So we focus sometimes too much on capacity without also taking capability into the mix. And finally, creativity. I think the criminals are creative, and we need to be at least as creative and at least as cooperative as them. So thank you very much. I look forward to questions and discussion.